demonstrating that it felt it had the ability to come back into the battle should it restart and inflict pain not only essentially on U.S. associated shipping, but on the United States Gulf allies and partners. So this is a real. I think it would be too much to describe it at this moment as a setback, because as far as we know, we're still in a ceasefire, but it is a fundamental blow to that aspiration that an off-ramp, an adequate off. In effect, in suspended animation. Of course, we may learn more details about this from the Iranian side, how they interpret it, but we do know that Iranian state media just over the past few hours have been talking about the extreme pressure that they were being put on by the United States delegation. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Iran typically negotiates over the long term. The two sides came into this as fundamentally different positions. The vice president really felt that he could sort of make a judgment relatively quickly, that he appeared to want to try to do things quickly, and the Iranians' way of negotiating is a fundamentally much slower process, and that does appear to be part of what we've witnessed, not just a difference in what both sides wanted, but a difference in the way they set about trying to achieve it.
When it comes to some of those differences, the vice president telling you, Nick, that there's a lack of an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon or tools to achieve a nuclear weapon, referring to their uranium stockpile. Nick Payne-Walsh, again, asking those questions to the vice president as we receive. Again, Nick Robertson, thank you so much for being there, asking those questions to the vice president to try to get more clarity on the situation. That my understanding is that the vice president said that he has communications already established with the president. Any indication, Julia, that that we'll be hearing from President Trump?
We still have not heard from President Donald Trump directly. We know that he is here in a social setting at the UFC fights. And according to reporters in the room, he has lots of family members there, but also Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And from those notes that we're getting from the reporters that are there, we know that around this same time that Vice President J.D. Vance came out and made this announcement that there was no deal, that these talks had not been successful. We know that Rubio leaned over and he whispered something to the president. They described it as he had his hands up, couldn't read his lips. You couldn't tell what he was saying, but safe to assume this may have had something to do with this topic. Now, prior to these talks, Vance had said that he believed that this could be positive, but that Trump had given them these guidelines going into this. They knew what they were looking for, and ultimately they did not find it. And I was thinking some of what Vance said today about where these sticking points were and what happened.
I would say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement. And I think that's bad news for Iran, much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could. And they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
And so you hear Vance say there that this is much worse for them than it is for us. That echoes what we heard from Trump when he traveled out here to Florida today. As he left the White House, he answered some questions, and he ultimately said that it didn't really matter from his viewpoint how these talks went, because he believed that the United States had already won militarily. He did not believe that these talks had to be successful to claim a win here. Now, Vance, when he went into details details on the red lines and exactly what the United States was looking for. I want to read for you part of what he said. He said, "The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon." He said that they did not receive that. And that echoes something that we heard from Trump here just several weeks ago while I was in Florida. He gave his first press conference since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury. And in remarks to Republican lawmakers right before that press conference, he said, "We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough." And I was able to press him on that. What was enough? What was his baseline for ending this conflict? And he said that they had to be able to confirm that they were not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. They had to look at negotiators like Witkoff, who was in the room. Of course, he's there in Islamabad as well, playing a key role here. But they had to be able to look at people like him and confirm that they weren't going to take steps toward it.
Julie Benbrook, thank you so much for that. Do let us know if we hear from the president there in Florida where you are. Let's go to, now we could go to David Sanger, who's also been closely following the situation. He's a CNN political and national security analyst and also a reporter for the New York Times. David, it's good to see you. You and I have spoken multiple times leading up to these talks. Let me just start by getting your initial reaction to this. What awaits the vice president when he returns to the United States?
Well, first of all, no surprise here, Polo. The 2015 agreement took about 2 years to negotiate. It took nearly 70 trips back and forth to Europe for negotiating sessions with the Obama administration. And in the end, what did they get? They got a commitment never to build a nuclear weapon, a commitment Iran's made many times before because it's also a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it has to make that commitment. So that part of the vice president's statement seemed a little confusing. They have already agreed on that issue. Whether they are enforcing that or not is another issue. And then the second part that was really fascinating was he said they will not give up the ability, the tools to be able to build a weapon in the future. And that is code word for they won't give up the stockpile of nuclear fuel and or the right to enrich uranium in the future, the right to produce more in the future. And so it looks like that old, which led to the breakdown of the negotiations in February that led to the war, is still a sticking point.
Don't go anywhere, David Sanger. I wonder if we can bring in Jennifer Hensler, the CNN reporter, just for some additional reporting. What are you hearing after hearing from the vice president and the lack of agreement between the Iranians and the United States?
Well, Polo, it's hard to underscore how many unanswered questions we have here in terms of what happens next. We heard from the vice president saying that this is their best and final offer, but we haven't heard a timeline in which they would need the Iranians to respond. We haven't heard, for example, if there'll be working level negotiations that continue beyond this meeting in Islamabad. We also haven't heard questions on what happens next when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. This is, of course, a key issue in all of these negotiations as the Iranians has basically throttled the freedom of navigation through this critical waterway. This is something that Europe is heavily dependent on, ships being able to transit through this strait. We don't know now if that continues to remain a demand, if there is still going to be a push to have this fully reopened in the coming weeks. We also don't know whether the ceasefire is going to continue to hold for these 2 weeks. This was what was announced, when the president announced this last week, that it would be a 2-week ceasefire. Now that these talks have ended without there being any sort of resolution, will the U.S. continue its military operations here? We don't have answers on all of these in these early hours after the vice president's remarks. He, only gave very, very brief remarks there in Islamabad after this marathon day of negotiations. And so there are a lot of questions that I'm sure we're all going to our sources with right now. So I could try to get some clarity here, but there is a lot at stake coming out of these talks. And we have also yet to hear from the other parties to these negotiations, the Pakistanis as well as the Iranians. I'm sure Tehran will seek to spin this in their own way as well. whether or not they see eye to eye in terms of what is the major gap, as David mentioned, this idea of enrichment and no nuclear weapons. This is something Iranian officials have publicly said they are not seeking a nuclear weapon. There have not been the ability to verify where they are in terms of enrichment after last year's strikes by U.S. and Israeli forces. The IAEA has not been able to get on the ground since the start of those offensives last year. So that would be key in any deal here. But there, again, I cannot stress how many questions we are seeking to have answers here. Polo.
Jennifer Hanser, thank you so much. We'll let you get back to your sources and do check back with us with any new information. Let's go back to David Sanger now and pick up on where we left off. David, the other thing that took away from that, as the vice president said, it's bad news to Iran more than for the United States. How do the people of Iran take this now with the president threatening to increase strikes if no deal was reached?
Well, perhaps he will, Polo, but I actually think that with the ceasefire in place, it's going to be a difficult decision for the president to resume the kind of military action that the U.S. was engaged in until a few days ago. Just think, we just saw inflation numbers tick up, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Going back into attacks on Iran would probably send the stock market down, would probably send the price of oil up, would probably promise that there will be significantly more gas price increases and increases in everything else, and fertilizer shortages and shortages of helium to make semiconductors. So I think it would be a difficult decision for the president. I think the Iranians know it. And I think the Iranian message, at least from the government here, was just because we got pounded for 38 days doesn't mean that we have fundamentally changed our view on in the Iranian view, their right to produce uranium and do what other signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are allowed to do.
What do you read into the fact that we didn't hear the vice president mention the Strait of Hormuz?
Really interesting. I mean, first of all, the Strait of Hormuz opening was supposed to be a condition of the ceasefire. It was not even supposed to be a subject of negotiation here. The negotiation here might be, you heard the president float the...
It's got proprietary template material. I used to get a lot of back pain, but now I don't have sunburn like I used to. I love that this has cool to the touch material.
Obviously are making a claim that they control the strait, and that their military will get involved in doing that. That has not happened during the 47 years of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So remember, though, that the strait crisis was a result of the war. It was not one of the causes of the war. And so that's got to get negotiated almost separately as a way of defanging the Iranians' one big control over the global economy. And frankly, they've discovered in the past month that that's as valuable or more valuable than the prospect that they could get a nuclear weapon.
21 hours of negotiations that continue to hold that valuable negotiating chip. David, I have a couple of seconds left with you. Just curious, what's the lingering question? Do these negotiations remain open-ended?
Well, that's the... President Vance gave some kind of deadline, because the last thing the administration wants to do is get sucked into a lengthy negotiation here. But he mentioned no deadline during the course of this time, and the Iranians have to guess whether or not the president's willing to back that up. Now, one thing the U.S. could do, short of a resumed attack, is cut off all traffic coming out of the strait, basically saying if you're going to close it to America and its allies, you could close it to all. But we don't know that he's done that yet.
Even know if he's thought about that yet. So we'll have to see. David Sanger's always lucky to have that insight. Thank you so much for your time following that breaking news out of the Middle East. quickly out of Islamabad, Pakistan. Stay with CNN. For viewers in the U.S., the premiere of CNN original series, Kara Swisher Wants to Live Forever, starts right now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Well, good morning, everybody. And let me say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Ceasefire talks between the U.S. and Iran underway in Pakistan. Vice President J.D. Vance leading the U.S. delegation, negotiating with top Iranian officials. His main task, solidify a ceasefire agreement that has been fragile from the moment President Trump announced it. The most urgent item, the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has slowed maritime traffic down to a trickle. And now the New York Times reporting that lost Iranian mines will be making reopening a difficult project. Just as important, but absent from most headlines right now, Iran's nuclear program and stockpile of highly enriched nuclear fuel. What happens to that? Complicating an already tough picture for the Vance team, strategic differences with Israel. At President Trump's request, Israel has scaled back its strikes on Lebanon ahead of the talks. And CNN reporting that China preparing to send Iran anti-aircraft weapons. That's based on U.S. intelligence. Beijing has denied it. So as Vice President Vance negotiates, the picture is chaotic, but it's notable that he's the man heading the U.S. delegation, as he has argued against striking Iran in the first place. Joining me now to make sense of all of this is CNN senior military analyst, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and Vice Chair of the Carlyle Group, Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral, I feel vindicated because on radio this week, I thought I was asking a stupid question of you when I said, do they know where the mines are? And now here's the Times reporting that Iran apparently doesn't know. And the president announced via Truth Social this morning that the U.S. is going to clear the strait. So please speak to that new development.
Well, just like in the world of aviation, where everyone knows about smart bombs and dumb bombs, there are smart mines and there are dumb mines. So smart mines can be turned on and off. They are pretty sophisticated. You typically know exactly where they're placed. They're tethered to the ground. You've got control of them. That's a smart minefield. I think what the Iranians have done is create kind of a dumb minefield. They probably got some smart mines in there, and they probably know where some of them are. But they've dumped a lot of big, dumb iron mines into the water. Maybe they're tethered to a few bricks. Maybe they've broken loose. Maybe they are floating around. So, Michael, if I'm the master, the captain of a big 200,000-ton oil tanker, I'm not enthusiastic about having the honor of leading the first convoy through the strait when this thing gets cleared up.
Pakistan, where it is just past 4 a.m. there. Marathon negotiations between the United States and Iran still underway. These are the highest level face-to-face negotiations between Washington and Tehran since the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979. Pakistani sources saying the overall tone of the talks has been positive, but a key sticking point remains control of the critical Strait of Hormuz. Now, the talks come as the fragile ceasefire between the two nations has the Middle East and the world on edge. Threatening that ceasefire, Israel strikes on Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah, an Iran-backed paramilitary group. There is disagreement over whether Lebanon is part of that current ceasefire agreement. Both Israel and Hezbollah continued exchanging attacks today. Let's bring in CNN's Julia Benbrook, who is traveling with President Trump in Florida this evening. Julia, what is the president saying?
Well, President Donald Trump, he's going to spend his weekend here in Florida, and he has spent a number of his weekends here since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, almost all of them at one of his properties here. But while he's here, he has a delegation in Islamabad for these negotiations with Iran. That's led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And as Trump left the White House today, he essentially said that it doesn't really matter how talks go because he believes that the United States has already won here. Take a listen.
We win, no matter what. We've defeated their military. They have no Navy. 158 ships are underwater, undersea. All of their minesweepers and all of their, they call them mine droppers. Can you imagine? A country has 28 mine droppers. You think that's nice? With all of that being said, they're all defeated, by the way. They're all at the bottom of the sea. Now, with all of that, they have no Navy. They have no radar. They have no Air Force. Their leaders are all dead. Khomeini is gone. For many years, he ruled. He's gone. With all of that, let's see what happens. But from my standpoint, I don't care.
Now, it's the middle of the night there where the talks are taking place, and these have gone on for hours. Trump did say that he was receiving updates throughout that time, but that's the latest that we have from the administration. Prior to these talks, though, Vance did say that he did believe that this could be positive. There could be a positive outcome here. He also said that Trump had given him and the rest of the negotiating team, quote, clear guidelines as they went into this. But there's a lot of questions about if there can be common ground here between these two groups. Going into this, there was that agreement, this 2-week ceasefire that Trump announced. And at the time, he said that the 10-point plan that he had received from the Iranians was a workable basis.
Welcome to Canes. It's Luke. Today I'm raising funds with Raising Canes and my buddy Todd Grant.
Areas that the United States could agree to, including reparations for war damages, as well as acknowledging its control of the Strait of Hormuz. And that critical waterway is no doubt a part of these discussions. That's where 20% of the world's oil typically passes through. It went to a near complete halt during this conflict, and it was one demand that Trump had for this ceasefire to be in place. Iran's foreign minister said that it would coordinate passage of vessels through that strait, and Trump said the United States would be assisting. Now, we did learn from U.S. Central Command that Navy-guided missile destroyers were going through at this time. They'd begun clearing mines, and those were the first U.S. vessels that we know had been going in the straits since the beginning of this conflict. Jessica.
All right, Julia Benbrook in Miami, thank you so much for that. We are joined now by former Energy Secretary in the Obama administration. He's also a nuclear physicist, Ernest Moniz. He was a negotiator of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, working with then Secretary of State John Kerry. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here with us. We do appreciate your time. I want to start first with a central goal of this war from the Trump administration was ensuring Iran would not have a nuclear weapon, that could not happen. In your assessment, are we closer to that after the last several weeks? Where does that stand?
Well, frankly, I don't see much change in these few weeks on that question. Clearly, last June, with the Israeli and U.S. bombing of the nuclear sites, there was a substantial destruction. We don't know exactly how much, but a substantial destruction of their nuclear capabilities. But the main point is that Iran, since the president withdrew from the 2015 agreement, had reached about a half a ton of 60% enriched uranium. I don't want to be too technical on this, but so-called weapons grade is 90%. However, there's a misconception that 90% or weapons grade uranium is required to build a nuclear explosive. It's not true.
Breaking news tonight out of Pakistan. Talks between the U.S. and Iran still underway. They now have extended into early Sunday morning. That's local time there. Pakistani sources saying the discussions have been positive. One sticking point, and it's a big one, continues to be the vital Strait of Hormuz. Back in Washington, President Trump had this to say about the talks.
We're in very deep negotiations with Iran. We win regardless. We've defeated them militarily. They probably have a couple of mines in the water. We have minesweepers out there. We're sweeping the strait. In addition to that, we're negotiating. Whether we make a deal or not makes no difference to me.
We're joined now by retired Army Major General Randy Manner. General Manner, thank you so much for being here with us. I want to start first with what CENTCOM said earlier today. It announced that 2 Navy-guided missile destroyers have begun clearing mines in that strait. Walk us through this process. What stands out to you about this announcement, and what more people should know?
This is actually a substantial announcement. That means that the Iranians are permitting U.S. Navy destroyers to transit the strait. That is a very big deal. Secondly, we have to remember there are 4 kinds of mines the Iranians have been using. The first are going to be seabed mines, ones that are on the seabed itself and can be activated by a ship passing over. Moored or tethered mines, drifting mines, and then the most sophisticated are the ones that actually detect a ship and rise out of the water and fire a missile. The destroyers, they're going to have 3 different capabilities to locate and to neutralize those mines. The first one is going to be Blackhawks to locate them, also drones in the air and undersea, as well as, of course, on the sea. And then, of course, sensors that are pulled behind the destroyers that will also detect mines. And then, of course, there are electronic means to be able to neutralize the mines that they do find.
A crazy person doesn't live in the White House. A person who plays a crazy person a lot on TV lives there. I'm Michael Smerconish in the Philly Burbs. Bill Maher said those words last spring after having dinner with President Trump at the White House. And then he added, which I know is effed up, it's just not as effed up as I thought it was. A hue and cry followed. Festivus ensued when Larry David satirized Maher in the New York Times under the headline, "My Dinner with Adolf." And in a choice between 2 of my favorite comedians, I stood with Maher on the theory that it's better to have dialogue and to break bread than to demonize. Maher was mingling with the President of the United States, and guess what? When the dinner ended, he went right back on TV and continued his biting analysis of Trump. And of course, the President eventually took to Truth Social to hit back at Bill Maher. The Maher dinner has been on my mind this week, watching Trump's Truth Social posts amidst the war in Iran. You've seen them by now. Easter Sunday, open the effing strait, you crazy bastards. And then on Tuesday, a whole civilization will die tonight. The reaction at home was fierce. Unhinged, screamed a Drudge headline. Others called for invocation of the 25th Amendment on the grounds that Trump had demonstrated he was unable to perform his duties. And Democrats, anticipating retaking the House in November, began using the I word, impeachment. Still, 90 minutes before Trump's Tuesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern deadline, a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan was announced. And something else happened on Tuesday. The New York Times published a deep dive by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, sharing reporting from their forthcoming book, Regime Change. This was a granular reconstruction of Trump's decision to go to war with Iran. For example, Haberman and Swan didn't just summarize what happened on February 11 when Benjamin Netanyahu came to the White House to sell an attack on Iran. They detail what was said by each participant in the Situation Room and also exactly where in the room everybody was seated. By this account, Netanyahu and Trump were aligned in hawkish thinking, but there was skepticism raised by Trump's team. The following day, when the Americans met without Israeli counterparts, CIA Director John Ratcliffe told Trump that Netanyahu's regime change scenarios were farcical. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it's bullshit. Vice President J.D. Vance was the most doubtful of the group. Quote, nobody in Mr. Trump's inner circle was more worried about the prospect of war with Iran or did more to stop it than the vice president. General Kane, chair of the Joint Chiefs, said the Israelis, quote, oversell their plans and are not always well developed. Notably, by this account, Trump was dismissive of Kane's concern that the Strait of Hormuz might be blocked by Iran. And then, in the final days of February, new intelligence revealed that the Ayatollah would be meeting above ground with other top officials from the regime in broad daylight and wide open to air attack. The president gave Iran another chance to strike a deal, but Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner reported from Geneva that the Iranians were playing games. On February 26, another meeting in the Situation Room ensued, and during the course of an hour and a half, the president said he, quote, wanted to go around the table and hear everyone's views. Vance repeated that an attack on Iran was a bad idea, but that he'd support the president's position. after CIA Director Ratcliffe discussed the stunning intel that the Iranian leadership was about to gather above ground in broad daylight at the Ayatollah's compound, the White House counsel David Warrington offered the opinion that the plan being presented to the president was legally permissible. General Kane told Trump he needed to decide by 4 p.m. the following day. Aboard Air Force One the next afternoon, 22 minutes before Kane's deadline, Trump gave the order. Operation Epic Fury is approved. No aborts. Good luck. I don't think that the Times reporting was a result of leaks. I think the administration wanted this story in the public domain. In contrast to those offensive and intemperate Truth Social posts, which were intended for Tehran, this window into pre-war decision-making was for the Americans. It shows airing of competing views, some open to dissent.
Every office has a naysayer. Meet Steve. The office naysayer loves going.
Door's account of an unstable Trump at the same time that he was playing the madman card in public. You'd expect the guy that posts about a whole civilization dying would be simultaneously busting up the White House furniture. But there's never been any reporting of Trump like that behind closed doors. In other words, it's not that there's a method to his madness, it's that the madness is his method. The trouble for the president, during Trump 1.0, the world didn't know what to expect. There was the British ambassador to the U.S. who resigned in 2019 after memos that he's written to the mother country came to light. One of which he wrote said this: "We don't really believe this administration is going to become substantially more normal, less dysfunctional, less unpredictable, less faction-riven, less diplomatically clumsy and inept." But now, writing in the Wall Street Journal, Peggy Noonan said she found the Truth Social posts horrifying, hitting a new bottom, and ineffective. The reason the madman theory worked for Richard Nixon, she wrote, if it did, was that world leaders knew he wasn't crazy, but might be tripped into extreme behaviors by an adversary's intransigence. Donald Trump plays the part of the madman every day. His head fake would be sanity. If his advisors thought this was a good negotiating tactic, give him a little madman theory, Mr. President. They really are hicks. What the Haberman-Swan reporting ultimately reveals, much like what Bill Maher saw at dinner, is that Donald Trump is capable of exactly what his critics say he isn't: patience, process, and genuine deliberation. He went around the table. He heard the dissent. He consulted the lawyers. He made a hard call under enormous pressure, and 90 minutes before his own deadline, a ceasefire materialized. That's not nothing. And it's certainly not the behavior of someone who needs the 25th Amendment invoked or warrants impeaching. Mr. President, here's some free advice. You don't need the Madman Act. It's no longer necessary. The real Trump, the one sitting at the head of the table in the Situation Room, is a more formidable figure than the one rage posting on Truth Social at midnight. Let the former lead. You don't need all the theater. And the results, they might speak for themselves. You're a leadership scholar, and you've known him for 25 years. So here's the question that I most want to ask you. Does he make decisions based on analysis or instinct?
He does it by a little bit of a combination of both, but more, believe it or not, analysis than instinct. He's been doing these same things for the entirety of his career, these same 10 levers, and sometimes they're delivered with in an emotional, impulsive seeming way, perhaps in a Truth Social a tweet that comes out at midnight. But these are not truly impulsive. These are deliberate strategic choices.
The perception is one of impulsivity and impatience. Are you telling me he's strategic?
He absolutely is strategic, Michael. When he divides and conquers, whether or not he doesn't like NAFTA, NATO, the Business Roundtable, whatever it is, this is something he's done his entire life. He knows that collective action is the way you counter somebody like him. Frankly, that's how a bully gets countered. He also knows that if he keeps repeating information, whether or not it's completely accurate or even completely false, is that eventually it will get traction and stick. So, you know, you can get 22% of the country to believe that Haitian refugees are eating their neighbors' pets. The Ohio governor, a Republican, and mayor and police chief say it's not true.
I know the way this goes. Writing in the New York Times recently, foreign affairs columnist Thomas L. Friedman says that when it comes to the war in Iran, President Trump has a way out. Keeping it simple, here's what he suggests. Iran gives up its more than 900 pounds of nearly bomb-grade, highly enriched uranium, and in return, the United States gives up on regime change. Both sides would then agree to end all hostilities, and that's it. No more American and Israeli bombing, no more Iranian and Hezbollah rockets, no more Strait of Hormuz blockade, and for darn sure, no U.S. troops on the ground landing in Iran. The three-time Pulitzer Prize winner and author of the best-selling book From Beirut to Jerusalem joins us now. Tom, I recognize the events are very, very fluid. I wonder if that's still your opinion, or are we too late for that kind of a deal?
That was written while the war was still going on, Michael. It's probably too late for that simple a deal right now. The Iranians have recognized the leverage they've gained from getting control of the Straits of Hormuz effectively. And so there's clearly going to have to be some arrangement that addresses that as well.
With regard to the enriched uranium, I noticed that has dropped in and out of things that the president and Secretary Rubio have said during the course of time. But after you published that piece on Truth Social, and we'll put this up on the screen, he said there will be no enrichment of uranium, and the United States will, working with Iran, dig up and remove all of the deeply buried nuclear dust. And then, Tom, yesterday, the president said this from the tarmac at Andrews. Roll that tape.
No nuclear weapon, number one. I think it's already been regime change, but we never had that as a criteria. No nuclear weapon. That's 99% of us.
Maybe you played a role in elevating it again on his agenda, but how do you see a possible solution given how events have transpired?
Michael, this has really become such a wicked problem that there's not going to be an easy one that doesn't involve Trump eating a full plate of crow, and maybe the Iranians to some extent as well.
In Pakistan tonight, delegations from the U.S. and Iran are engaged in face-to-face talks. President Donald Trump with a stark message back in Washington about those negotiations.
We're in very deep negotiations with Iran. We win regardless. We've defeated them militarily. They probably have a couple of mines in the water. We have minesweepers out there. We're sweeping the strait. In addition to that, we're negotiating. Whether we make a deal or not makes no difference to me.
This weekend's talks come amid a fragile ceasefire agreement between the two countries, although there's still no official word from negotiators. A source close to Tehran's negotiating team telling CNN the U.S. has made unacceptable demands over the Strait of Hormuz and several other issues. That echoes the sentiment of Iranian state media reporting, which also hinted at some sticking points. CNN military analyst and former U.S. security Israel and the Palestinian Authority, former U.S. Army Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz is here. General Schwartz, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. I want to get to the negotiations in just a second, but just kind of to bring people up to speed on the Strait of Hormuz, which frankly sounds to be one of the biggest sticking points, if not the stickiest sticking points in these negotiations. Can you tell us a little bit more about these U.S. efforts to sweep the mines there in the Strait, what that entails, and what that might mean going forward?
Well, I certainly see it as a positive sign. So two guided missile destroyers under U.S. Central Command authority started navigating the strait earlier, today, Middle East time. Those two guided destroyers also have additional capabilities, unmanned, UAVs that work in the maritime domain, so in the water, to also help them. It's a very slow and deliberate process. But the fact that they've successfully navigated the strait, at least from the last reporting I've seen, and are now up into the mouth of the Persian Gulf, is very positive. But the intent is to continue to work and really set conditions for an increase in maritime commerce to move through the strait safely and not be held victim to the conditions that Iran is, putting forth even prior to going into these negotiations. Eventually, maybe it's by the IAEA, the highly enriched uranium, as well as no more enrichment to occur inside of Iran. And then number two is the strait, I would assume, in terms of the negotiating terms that are being discussed today.
Yeah, and you mentioned the other big one, which is that enriched uranium, their nuclear program. How would you assess that as an issue right now, both in terms of the military campaign that we
certainly their entire program, a nuclear program, is significantly degraded, just given the amount of strikes, going all the way back to Midnight Hammer that took place in June of 2025 up till all the engagements that began on the 28th of February. So to be able to reconstitute the capability that Iran had even after Midnight Hammer is going to take a very long time. I've heard a number of different estimates, 10, 15 years. It's all about the will and the amount of emphasis that Iran wants to put on it. But no doubt it is significantly degraded. But they clearly have the intellectual capital to reproduce it.
It's where the marathon peace talks between the U.S. and Iran have ended in an impasse. CNN's Nick Robertson was there asking Vice President J.D. Vance, who led that U.S. delegation, what led to this deadlock. Here's what he said.
We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
And the Vice President and the rest of the U.S. delegation headed back to the U.S. with still a host of questions lingering about the ongoing war. Vice President Vance, he did not say whether Tehran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And even before the talks had concluded, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had announced that the military campaign against Iran was not over yet. Our continuing coverage a little later here on CNN. I'm Polo Sandoval. African Voices is next, and I'll be back at the top of the hour with another update. And good evening to you. I'm Polo Sandoval in New York. We are following some breaking news out of Islamabad, Pakistan. That's where delegations from the U.S. and Iran, they have been holding marathon negotiations now on how to potentially end this war. Vice President J.D. Vance, we're told, is potentially about to speak any moment now. Of course, the Vice President leading the U.S. delegation in those talks that began hours ago. I'll continue to get those updates from the White House and also from the Iranians. But you see here the Vice President arriving to these crucial, what have been described as make or break talks when it comes to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, specifically the war with Iran, as a U.S. delegation meeting with their Iranian counterparts there, hosted by the Pakistanis as they try to find some common ground. Deep distrust issues certainly going into this, with a high level of skepticism about what, if anything, could come out of these talks, potentially at least a framework with the future of the Middle East certainly on the line here, and for global markets around the world as well. I believe we may have CNN's Nick Robertson, who has been following these talks already for hours in Islamabad, to give us an update on what's happening there. I'm told we're going to get to him in just a few moments as we try to establish contact. But again, this comes after just hours of talks that have been ongoing, with earlier today, Iran's semi-official news agency pointing out what it described as, quote, excessive demands by the United States, that state media saying, considering the U.S.'s excessive demands, it seems that this is the Iranian team's last chance to reach a common framework in this round of talks that could potentially mean some insurmountable differences between the two. I want you to listen in now on some of the latest remarks from the Commander-in-Chief, from President Trump. Again, be the one that ultimately make the final decision, while his son-in-law and his vice president continue with those talks. Here's what the president said recently.
We win, no matter what, undersea. All of their minesweepers and all of their, they call them mine droppers. Can you imagine? A country has 28 mine droppers. You think that's nice? With all of that being said, they're all defeated, by the way. They're all at the bottom of the sea. Now, with all of that, they have no Navy. They have no radar. They have no Air Force. Their leaders are all dead. Khomeini's gone. For many years, he ruled. He's gone. With all of that, let's see what happens. But from my standpoint, I don't care.
And again, these are the live pictures where at the location of these ongoing talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, we're told that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, is expected any moment now to at least update reporters there on the ground with exactly where those talks currently are. Some additional reporting that we've received from our colleagues there recently with Sophia Saifi in Islamabad reporting that reporters there are essentially beginning to fade under those bright lights, which really gives you a sense of just how long these talks have been going without any potential end right now at the convention center as they continue to wait for any potential nugget of information. And that really underscores the importance of what we could potentially see any moment now when these doors open. And as we expect, J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, to bring us an update on the situation. For now, though, let's head over to CNN's Nick Robertson, who again has been following these talks on the ground for hours, just to give us a sense of where things are and what we've heard from these delegations. Nick, if you can hear us, we can hear you.
Yeah, it's really, and I'm speaking quietly because we're just expecting the Vice President to step into this small press room in just a couple of minutes. It's really been talks that have been shrouded in a huge amount of secrecy. We're looking at over 16 hours of talks. It was daylight. It went to sundown through the night, and the sun is already up here in Islamabad. So that gives you an idea of just how long this has been going on. But in terms of details coming out of these talks, really, we've only had a sense of the duration. Of course, Iranian state media have been putting out a variety of lines, but it does appear as if one of the sticking points has been around the issue of the Strait of Hormuz. But precisely what the details of that difficulty, if that is the difficulty, that really isn't clear. But this has been an absolutely marathon session of talks, beginning with the Vice President meeting with Pakistan's Prime Minister, then going into sort of indirect talks, and then very quickly transitioning into trilateral talks in a room with the Iranian delegation, the U.S. delegation, and Pakistan mediators all in the room. There appeared to have been perhaps breaks where technical papers were written, where talks went into technicalities. But at the moment, we really do not understand what has been agreed. We know that going into these talks, the Iranian side said that they were coming in with a 10-point plan, and Pakistani officials were indicating that they were hoping to get a bridge and get agreement on 5 or 6 or 7 of those particular points, but it's not clear at all at this time what may or may not have been agreed.
Nick, as we wait for the Vice President to emerge here with an update, and forgive me if we have to interrupt you when that happens, can you just remind viewers how Lebanon ties into all of this, specifically what the Iranians wanted to potentially see out of any framework when it comes to Israel targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Yeah, the Iranians said that they wanted a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, their proxy in Lebanon, as part of the broader ceasefire that Iran has agreed to over this sort of 2-week period with the United States and Israel. That it wanted Lebanon brought into that. That was something that was resisted by the Israeli Prime Minister. He did appear to agree to sort of back off on some of the strikes against the Hezbollah targets inside of Lebanon. But the Iranians said that was a fundamental part of their understanding of getting into the ceasefire. The Pakistan Prime Minister at the early phase of this said that was his understanding as well. That was the position Pakistani diplomats were taking.
DR Field and Brush Mowers are built for one job. Yours. These are proven professional grade machines.
Not the understanding that they had given to Iran, and that was a strong position Iran was coming into these talks with. However, the Vice President said that he was positive coming here and that he believed any misunderstandings could be overcome. And it does seem that from an Iranian perspective, just before the talks began, state media there was saying that they saw a diminution, a reduction in the number of strikes by Israel into Lebanon, and that they said that gave them the confidence to come into the talks. Of course, one of the other things that the Iranians said in the sort of 24 hours leading into the talks that they wanted assets unfrozen, and it does appear that the Vice President is about to arrive. So I've got my eye on that door, and as soon as you see it open on camera, and as soon as I see it open, I will go quiet. Yeah, but that was something that the Iranians were saying they wanted to see these assets of billions of dollars frozen. Those unfrozen. There were indications from the Iranian media today that they had got those unfrozen. We understood from the Vice President's office that was from the White House at least that was not the case. So all of it, there are a lot of outstanding questions. There's a question that we understood from CENTCOM today about demining vessels moving into the Strait of Hormuz, and we've later in the day heard from Iranian state media saying that there can be no movement of military vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. So there's been a lot of I call it spin or propaganda from the Iranian side setting out their position, but watching their narrative through the day, it does appear that the Iranians have sort of been explaining to their public why they've remained engaged in the talks, because they say they're looking after their national interests, that this is the right thing to do, that they're moving in the right direction. So from sort of what seemed like a very hardline position on certain issues, just barely 24 hours ago, the Iranians do seem to have sort of explained away why they've moved into the talks and why they're taking certain positions, but they have been and kept up a very sort of firm line on the Strait of Hormuz, at one point claiming that they told the Pakistani interlocutors here that if a U.S. frigate moved into the Strait of Hormuz, then they would target it. Again, this isn't something that we've been able to stand up and verify. This is just something that the Iranians are claiming. Perhaps we may get some insight from the Vice President now. But these, I think it's hard to underestimate or overestimate, if you will, just how hard and tough negotiations like this are. 16 hours of talks. This is the highest level meeting between U.S. and Iranian officials in almost half a century, since the Iranian Revolution, when the Ayatollahs took power back in 1979. So this is a meeting of huge consequence, and of course huge interest to the world. What happens, what has been agreed around the table or not agreed, it is going to have an immediate effect on the geopolitics of the region, but most fundamentally on the economy, the cost of gas at the pump in the United States and around the world. As we've already seen in some countries, even in Europe, there's been levels of social unrest because of shortages of gas, the cost of gasoline for vehicles. So I think this is sort of why you have this sense coming into this moment after so many hours of discussions, the details of what has been agreed and not agreed. And I think we need to stress here what may well have been not agreed is very important. When you look at talks like this, historical talks like this that try to end wars, oftentimes they are incredibly fraught. There's a lot of going backwards and forwards, toing and froing. But I think it's indicative that the two sides sat at the table here for 16 hours and continued their talks all the way through the night. Is indicative that both sides kind of wanted to push through, that they thought they were making gains, that they thought they could reach a target point. The fact that the press conference here has been stood by, the cameras set up, the microphones tested, everyone looking at the door waiting for the Vice President to walk through, and they're still waiting and looking at the door for him to walk through, is also indicative of a potential for some kind of last minute, backwards and forwards, working out of details, trying to hammer down and tie down final points, and undoubtedly, one can imagine that the Vice President will want to brief the President before he speaks to journalists. So we're really in those final moments before hearing the outcome, the product of these talks. 6 weeks of war, where there has been damage to oil infrastructure, where ships in the Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Gulf, bottled up because you can't get out through that narrow Strait of Hormuz, and the details of if that on. I think if you look at what Iranian state media is saying and the way that this is sort of these talks have been sort of briefed to the Iranian people, you get a sense there that the Iranian side has sort of come back from some of its tougher positions and given reasons for its negotiations. So I think that from that we tougher positions and given reasons for its negotiations. So I think that from that we can potentially infer that on some of the points that they wanted, there has been some common ground found, but we really do not have the detail on the core issue, which is the Strait of Hormuz right now.
Nick, I'll give you a moment just to assess the situation as you and I wait for those doors to open, as we wait to hear from the American delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance. Just underscoring those crucial points that you make and the importance of those talks right now. I should add direct talks that have been going on for 16 hours, as you pointed out, Nick, with the lives also of millions of people across the Middle East hinging, as well as the global economy, as you point out, hinging on what's happening there. Nick, we'll come back to you in a moment, but first I wonder if we can head back to the United States and go to Julia Benbrook in Miami. Julia, you've been in contact with the White House as you and I wait together. And again, apologies if we have to interrupt you if those doors open. But has President Trump perhaps hinted any possible, either positive or negative outcome of these crucial talks?
Well, a lot of the big announcements that we get from President Donald Trump throughout this entire conflict, including when he announced the beginning of Operation Epic Fury, those first joint U.S.-Israel strikes, have come on his True Social site. So, of course, we are keeping a close eye on that, refreshing often. But right now, the reason he's here in Florida, he is at the UFC fights with members of his family. That's where he is while this is taking place. He sent this delegation, though, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to Islamabad for these talks. And we know these have been going on for hours, the trilateral talks taking place over 12 hours, with Pakistan, of course, serving as a mediator there. But as these have been going on, this is a huge moment. Vice President J.D. Vance is going to walk through those doors soon and be at the front of this conversation with whatever announcement this will be. We did hear you're obsessed with your pet. At Open Farm, we're obsessed with the quality and standards of our farms. Receiving talks as these talks had gone on. And while he didn't really categorize how he felt about what he was hearing, but really said that it didn't really matter because he believes that the United States has already won. And I do believe that we have some of those remarks to play for you now.
We win, no matter what. We've defeated their military. They have no navy. 158 ships are underwater, undersea. All of their minesweepers and all of their, they call them mine droppers. Can you imagine? A country has 28 mine droppers. You think that's nice? With all of that being said, they're all defeated, by the way. They're all at the bottom of the sea. Now, with all of that, they have no navy. They have no radar. They have no air force. Their leaders are all dead. Khomeini is gone. For many years, he ruled. He's gone. With all of that, let's see what happens. But from my standpoint, I don't care.
So you hear him say there, from his standpoint, he doesn't care how these talks go. Going into this, Vance had said that he did believe that this could be a positive step. He also said that Trump gave him and others on the negotiating team clear guidelines going into this. A lot of questions, though, as we await these remarks. Is there a common ground here between these two parties? Because when Trump announced the 2-week ceasefire was going to take place, he said that the 10-point plan that the Iranians had sent was a workable basis on which to negotiate. But as more pieces of what was going to be in that potential plan became public, it was clear that there were a lot of things the United States would just not agree to, including reparations for war damages, as well as acknowledging control of the Strait of Hormuz. And that, no doubt, has been a big topic during these discussions today. That's the critical waterway where 20% of the world's oil typically passes through. And that was a key demand for Trump to have this ceasefire in place at all.
To come back to
get that reopened,
Correct. No, that's also important to point out. out. Julie, do come back to us if we hear from the president. If he, as you point out, he tends to really get ahead of things and make those crucial announcements on social media before we hear from authorities. So, Julia, stand by for us. I do want to go now to CNN's Jennifer Hansler, who's joining me on the phone. As we wait together, Jennifer, just tell us a little bit about, remind us really the nature of the delegation, the U.S. delegation that traveled to Pakistan to meet with the Iranians. The president appointing his vice president, J.D. Vance, whose usual political position has been to not get the U.S. involved in any further foreign entanglements, yet he's leading the delegation this time.
Yeah, that's right, Paulo. And it's very interesting because we had heard from sources this was actually a preference of the Iranians as well because of that very nature of not wanting to get involved in foreign interventions. They saw him as perhaps a more negotiable mediator than those they had dealt with in the past. At the same time, we have seen those two players who have been at the table in every single round of talks that predate this war, that is Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, as well as the Deputy National Security Advisor, Andy Baker, someone we didn't see at the table in Islamabad is Secretary of State Marco Rubio. We just got some interesting color from the White House tool. Rubio is with the president in Miami right now for that UFC fight, and they said that Rubio was leaning in and whispering very closely with the president in the past several minutes. Likely on this, we don't know for sure, but that would, of course, make a lot of sense in this case. And of course, if everyone is saying here, whether or not they get to an agreement at that stage, that is just the first step in all of this. There is then the implementation of any deal that is reached here. And it's going to be the next challenge here. And in addition to the Strait of Hormuz, of course, another major obstacle here is Lebanon. The Iranians and the Pakistanis have indicated that Lebanon was not part of this ceasefire. And this is a point of contention between the two sides. The U.S. is supposed to broker talks next week at the State Department between the Israelis and the Lebanese. That would be direct talks between the two sides as Israel has continued its military assault against Lebanon, saying they are targeting Hezbollah. There have been a number of civilian targets that have been hit over the past several days since this ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran went into place. So that also poises to become a spoiler in this situation. But we're all watching for this press conference from Vice President Vance in the coming minutes. This will be the first fulsome statement we have heard from the U.S. since the start of these negotiations more than 12 hours ago.
Jennifer Hansen joining us on the phone with all that important context about the delegation that is on the ground now and has been speaking directly to the Iranians for hours. Thank you for that, Jennifer. I want to go to Aaron David Miller now, former State Department Middle East negotiator. You have some important context here, some important insight here, given your background. Just what do you make of how long these talks have been going and all the points that my colleagues have been making in the last 30 minutes or so?
You know, Arab-Israeli and U.S.-Iranian negotiations tend to have only two speeds, right? Slow and slower. But what is so remarkable, against the backdrop of 6 weeks of extraordinary conflict, in which the world's most formidable military power and regional's most formidable military power, the U.S. and Israel, conducted a comprehensive series of strikes against all kinds of targets in Iran. It's almost as if the switch has been flipped in an extraordinary moment of 15 hours of negotiations. Now, how many of those hours were direct, indirect, trilateral? But to last 15 hours, you'd have to draw one of two conclusions. Either the talks were on the verge of cratering, and the Iranian, Pakistani, and U.S. sides want to do everything possible to save them, or alternatively, I mean, I'd like to think so, you actually had some congruence, some meeting of common ground, and perhaps even, I'm speculating here, an exchange of texts, actual drafting of what could provide the outlines of an agreement. I mean, we'll know soon enough, but I have to say it's extraordinary given the complexity of the issues. Highly enriched uranium, what to do about Iran's putative nuclear aspirations, Straits of Hormuz, sanctions, unfreezing Iranian frozen assets, any number of other issues that, in fact, you may actually have had a first session that negotiations and perhaps find a pathway out of this conflict.
Yeah, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson saying that these intensive negotiations between both countries have continued uninterrupted until the early hours in Islamabad. We should point out it's currently 6:23 a.m. there, and that the Strait of Hormuz and Tehran's nuclear program are certainly issues that are being discussed. David, what is the kind of pressure that the U.S. is up against, especially the economic pressures, even before they landed in Pakistan yesterday?
You know, I think time is a critical arbiter in any negotiation, right? The real question, a negotiation succeeds when the negotiators on each side have a mutual sense of urgency. That is to say, there's enough pain for each of them to want to get to the negotiating table and the prospects of gain to actually reach an agreement. I would think, and I may have to revise my own analysis here, that the Iranian clock was moving at a much slower rate than the American clock.
The size of the delegation from Iran, we were talking about this just a little over 24 hours ago. Actually, Aaron David Miller, stand by for me as we see now the Vice President emerge. We want to take you live now to Islamabad for an update from the U.S. delegation led by the Vice President.
Well, good morning, everybody. And let me say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made it very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
Precisely what have they rejected here? Can you help us understand it a little bit?
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we've negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will. Jen.
Was there a framework on anything? And also, did the Iranians throw any assets come up, and did you reach any conclusions on those assets?
We talked about all those issues, Jen, and we talked about a number of issues beyond that. And so certainly those things came up. But again, we just could not get to a situation where the Iranians were willing to accept our terms. I think that we were quite flexible. We were quite accommodating. The president told us, you need to come here in good faith and make your best effort to get a deal. We did that. And unfortunately, we weren't able to make any headway. Preston.
Mr. Vice President, how often did you communicate with President Trump throughout the negotiations? There were reports that there were multiple rounds, where there were breaks in between negotiations. How often did you communicate with the president throughout those rounds, and what was he saying as you were going through these negotiations that you said fell short?
Yeah, obviously we were talking to the president consistently. I don't know how many times we talked to him, a half dozen times, a dozen times over the past 21 hours. We obviously also talked to Admiral Cooper, to Pete, to Marco, to the entire national security team. We talked to Scott Bessent a number of times. So look, we were constantly in communication with the team because we were negotiating in good faith. And we leave here.
We want to have eyes on every step of the process. So from start to finish, we know exactly what happened to that product.
That is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it. Thank you.
Where did the trade rumors? Did you go back to work?
All right, that update that just All right, and that marks the conclusion now of those remarks that came from the Vice President, J.D. Vance, offering that update. The headline, they have not chosen to accept our terms, referring to the Iranian delegation that met there for a total of 21 hours of talks, according to the Vice President, with that simple proposal that has been put there on the table. Let's go to Nick Robertson now, who's live there in Islamabad. Nick, I heard you pressing the Vice President, trying to expand on where those sticking points are. Tell us more about what he said.
Well, I think one of the takeaways here is also what was not said, and the Vice President did sort of get this question at the end, which is essentially what next? Is it a return to war? And he said, we've given them the final and best offer. So it does appear as if the ball is now in the Iranian court, something that their top negotiating team, and we understand that a very big delegation here, could not amongst themselves put an adequate answer to. It is clear that if there are going to be more talks, and if they're going to be entered into in a productive way, Iran will have to have changed its position somehow. But I think the details that we have here are enough for us to understand that a question mark, a fundamental question mark now stands. How long does Iran have to come back with its next answer to the final and best offer from the United States? How long do they have to make that decision? And what are the consequences if they don't? Remember, going into this ceasefire, it was just 3 hours away from what the president had described as civilizational annihilation. And he was talking about a massive round of attacks on key Iranian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, rail networks, all these sorts of potential targets were quite literally on the table, and as we understood it, dialed into the munitions that were ready to be delivered onto those targets. So when does that come into play again? Does it come into play? We're again, I think, left with a lot of questions, but I think there have been a real hope overnight tonight that the fact that the talks have gone so long, the fact that they had tried to push so many hours into the early hours this morning to get a successful resolution, really had sort of built a sense of hope that maybe that this was a job that was being done, just taking time. But I think what we've witnessed here tonight is the fundamental gaps and differences between the Iranian side, and of course we know that they fundamentally believe that they still have a military capacity, a quantity of drones, a quantity of ballistic missiles, the ability to hit fundamental and key targets as they did on Wednesday after the ceasefire deadline, such as the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, a very important pipeline. Iran was demonstrating that it felt it had the ability to come back into the battle should it restart and inflict pain, not only or potentially on U.S. associated shipping, but on the United States Gulf allies and partners. So this is a real, I think it would be too much to describe it at this moment as a setback, because as far as we know, we're still in a ceasefire, but it is a fundamental blow to that aspiration that an off-ramp, an adequate off-ramp could be put into play, and the oil to natural gas, all those tankers that are stuck in the Gulf at the moment could exit the Strait of Hormuz. All that still seems to be in effect in suspended animation. Of course, we may learn more details about this from the Iranian side, how they interpret it, but we do know that Iranian state media just over the past few hours have been talking about the extreme pressure that they were being put on by the United States delegation. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Iran typically negotiates over the long term. The two sides came into this in fundamentally different positions. The vice president really felt that he could sort of make a judgment relatively quickly that he appeared to want fundamentally much slower process, and that does appear to be part of what we witnessed, not just a difference in what both sides wanted, but a difference in the way they set about trying to achieve it.
When it comes to some of those differences, the vice president telling you, Nick, that there's a lack of an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon or tools to achieve a nuclear weapon, referring to their uranium stockpile. Nick Payne-Walsh, again, asking those questions to the vice president as we receive. Again, Nick Robertson, thank you so much for being there, asking those questions to the vice president to try to get more clarity on the situation. That my understanding is that the vice president said that he has communications already established. Is there any indication, Julia, that we'll be hearing from President Trump?
We still have not heard from President Donald Trump directly. We know that he is here in a social setting at the UFC fights. And according to reporters in the room, he has lots of family members there, but also Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And from those notes that we're getting from the reporters that are there, we know that around this same time that Vice President J.D. Vance came out and made this announcement that there was no deal, that these talks had not been successful. We know that Rubio leaned over and he whispered something to the president. They described it as he had his hands up, couldn't read his lips. You couldn't tell what he was saying, but safe to assume this may have had something to do with this topic. Now, prior to these talks, Vance had said that he believed that this could be positive, but that Trump had given them these guidelines going into this. They knew what they were looking for, and ultimately they did not find it. And I want to play for you some of what Vance said today about where these sticking points were and what happened.
Say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement. And I think that's bad news for Iran, much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States, having not come to an agreement. We've made it very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could. And they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
And so you hear Vance say there that this is much worse for them than it is for us. That echoes what we heard from Trump when he traveled out here to Florida today. As he left the White House, he answered some questions, and he ultimately said that it didn't really matter from his viewpoint how these talks went, because he believed that the United States had already won militarily. He did not believe that these talks had to be successful to claim a win here. Now, Vance, when he went into details on the red lines and exactly what the United States was looking for, I want to read for you part of what he said. He said, "The simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon and they will not receive that." And that echoes something that we heard from Trump here just several weeks ago while I was in Florida. He gave his first press conference since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury. And in remarks to Republican lawmakers right before that press conference, he said, "We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough." And I was able to press him on that. What was enough? What was his baseline for ending this conflict? And he said that they had to be able to confirm that they were not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. They had to look at negotiators like Witkoff, who was in the room. Of course, he's there in Islamabad as well, playing a key role here. But they had to be able to look at people like him and confirm that they weren't going to take steps toward it.
Julie Benbrook, thank you so much for that. Do let us know if we hear from the president there in Florida, where you are. Let's go to, now we could go to David Sanger, who's also been closely following the situation. He's a CNN political and national security analyst and also reporter at the Times. David, it's good to see you. You and I have spoken multiple times leading up to these talks. Let me just start by getting your initial reaction to this. What awaits the vice president when he returns to the United States?
Agreement took about 2 years to negotiate. It took nearly 70 trips back and forth to Europe for negotiating sessions with the Obama administration. And in the end, what did they get? They got a commitment never to build a nuclear weapon, a commitment Iran times before, because it's also a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it has to make that commitment. So that part of the vice president's statement seemed a little confusing. They already agreed on that issue. Whether they are enforcing that or not is another issue. And then the second part that was really fascinating was he said they will not give up the ability, the tools to be able to build a weapon in the future. And that is code word for they won't give up the stockpile of nuclear fuel and or the right to enrich uranium in the future, the right to produce more in the future. And so it looks like that old sticking point, which led to the breakdown of the negotiations in February that led to the war, is still a sticking point.
Don't go anywhere, David Sanger. I'm wondering if we can now bring in Jennifer Hensler, CNN's senior reporter, just for some additional reporting. Where are you hearing about, after hearing from the vice president and the lack of agreement between the Iranians and the United States?
Well, Paula, it's hard to underscore how many unanswered questions we have here in terms of what happens next. We heard from the vice president saying that this is their best and final offer, but we haven't heard a timeline in which they would need the Iranians to respond. We haven't heard, for example, if there'll be working level negotiations that continue beyond this meeting in Islamabad. We also haven't heard questions on what happens next when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. This is, of course, a key issue in all these negotiations, as the Iranians have basically throttled the freedom of navigation through this critical waterway. This is something that Europe is heavily dependent on, ships being able to transit through this strait. We don't know now if that continues to remain a demand, if there is still going to be a push to have this fully reopened in the coming weeks. We also don't know whether the ceasefire is going to continue to hold for these 2 weeks. This was what was announced, when the president announced this last week, that it would be a 2-week ceasefire. Now that these talks have ended without there being any sort of resolution, will the U.S. continue its military operations here? We don't have answers on all of these in these early hours after the vice president's remarks. He, only gave very, very brief remarks there in Islamabad after this marathon day of negotiations. And so there are a lot of questions that I'm sure we're all going to our sources with right now, so I could try to get some clarity here. But there is a lot at stake coming out of these talks, and we have also yet to hear from the other parties to these negotiations, the Pakistanis as well as the Iranians. I'm sure Tehran will seek to spin this in their own way as well, whether or not they see eye to eye in terms of what is the major gap, as David mentioned, this idea of enrichment and no nuclear weapons. This is something Iranian officials have publicly said they are not seeking a nuclear weapon. There have not been the ability to verify where they are in terms of enrichment after last year's strikes by U.S. and Israeli forces. The IAEA has not been able to on the ground since the start of those offensives last year, so that would be key in any deal here. But there, again, I cannot stress how many questions we are seeking to have answers here. Pull up.
Jennifer Hensler, thank you so much. We'll let you get back to your sources and do check back with us with any new information. Let's go back to David Sanger now and pick up on where we left off. David, the other thing that took away from that, as the vice president said, it's bad news to Iran more than for the United States. How do the people of Iran take this now with the president planning to increase strikes if no deal was reached?
Well, perhaps he will, Polo, but I actually think that with the ceasefire in place, it's going to be a difficult decision for the president to resume the kind of military action that the U.S. was engaged in until a few days ago. Just think, we just saw inflation numbers tick up, and it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Going back.
Tasneem agency, citing an informed sources, no change will occur in the situation at the Strait of Hormuz until Washington agrees to a reasonable deal. So again, the Iranians know that till they have control of the Strait of Hormuz, which can perhaps only be loosened through military action, they have a massive bargaining chip. After all, the Iranians do not have any other bargaining chip really beyond control of the Strait of Hormuz, because that's the only thing that they can use to create a pressure point on the American team. What we can tell you, however, is that both sides have identified the elephant in the room, which is really their major red zones. And I think that fundamentally is very, very critical. So those are the two main points. I just want to quickly bring in Mr. Kulkarni on this. Mr. Kulkarni, put your mind to what you've been hearing and give us an update.
What did I do? Out from the ball in the American court and say, look, you go back to the 27th of February, you get the state of Hormuz and to open, remains open. Now tell me, what is it that you will do to restore my civilization, restore all that what you've done, and how do I get back to work again? Because you destroyed Iran as much as you have. Now tell us, what is it that you think offering us for these two things? They take 27th of February. Why is it 27th and not 28th? Everybody said Oman was waiting, that well.
Well, the talks have taken place, but there is no agreement. After 21 hours of negotiations in Islamabad, US have walked away without any concrete deal. Both sides are now blaming US Vice President JD Vance said Washington put a final offer on the table. He said Iran simply refused to accept the terms. The key demand was clear commitment from Tehran to not pursue nuclear weapons and more. But Iran is pushing back hard. Iran accuses Washington of making unreasonable demands and blocking progress. The biggest sticking point also remains Iran's right to enrich uranium and the future of the Strait of Hormuz. So where does this leave the region and the war now? The ceasefire is holding for now. The mood is tense though. There's no breakthrough, no roadmap, no clarity on what happens next. What raises the big questions is also, does no deal now mean there will be escalation once the ceasefire period elapses? Could we see a return to strikes? And is diplomacy running out of time? For now, the talks have failed and the standoff is back where it started, with more uncertainty than ever.
Whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Let's go across to Colonel Rohit Dev, defense expert, now joining us. No real breakthrough. It kind of raises the question if the both sides even have the right connections to meet face to face and work out any agreement, given how wide the gap between the two sides is. If nuclear weapons, enriched uranium, and Strait of Hormuz are of the respective positions, that of Iran and the US, going into these talks?
Well, thanks for having me, Becky. Look, if the Vice President of the United States went to Islamabad, he didn't do so without some basic understanding that there is a good chance that these talks will succeed. Likewise, you don't have the Speaker of Parliament, who's now the de facto, ruler of the country, given the decapitation strikes and the elimination of top leadership. He's there as well. So this suggests to me that both sides are taking this very seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that, these talks will necessarily be successful. I suspect that at the very least, if these talks are to move forward, then something specific has to come out, some baseline understanding has to come out of these talks, which to be both direct in nature and indirect. So not everything is going to be solved today, but it's a start.
You have argued that Pakistan is not just an interlocutor today, but can, I quote here, shape perceptions on both sides and influence how Washington and Tehran see the process. Can you just expand on that?
Yes. Look, I think that this argument of mine applies a little more to Iran than to the United States, largely because Iran here is the weaker party and has a lot more to lose and is strategically lonely in its environment. And Pakistan is its only bet right now. There aren't any other countries that can effectively mediate with the United States. And that gives Pakistan a lot of space. And if the 11th hour, agreement in Islamabad today is an indication, it does show that the Pakistanis were able to convince the Iranians. And likewise, as this process matures, going from just sort of relaying messages, it gets to a point where, even the Americans say, okay, so what do you think about, the response from the other side? This isn't sort of a mechanical thing. This is an organic process.
That's fascinating. And certainly Pakistan, as a neighbor of Iran, of course, with a significant Shia Muslim population, has a huge interest in this conflict coming to an end and there being some peace around this region. When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's biggest bargaining chip, you could argue, what, if anything, can it loosen its chokehold? Do you assess that the Gulf states, so I'm here in the UAE, could play their trump card, excuse the pun, by refusing to ship any oil, for example, as long as Iran controls the strait?
So I think that the word option is probably more apt, because control connotes that there is sort of like a physical, if you will, capability with naval ships to physically blockade the thing. I think what's happening here is that the Iranian ability to fire missiles and drones across the Gulf creates a situation where the strait becomes impassable by commercial ships. But having said that, I think that we're in a new space right now. I mean, what was prior to February 28th doesn't exist anymore. First, the unthinkable has happened. Something that used to be a theoretical construct, which is the idea that Iran would attack its energy-rich Gulf Arab neighbors. And now that's created, and the same applies to the inability of ships to traverse through the strait. So this is something, in my opinion, which is probably going to be the hardest part of this negotiation. I think given past U.S.-Iranian nuclear negotiations, there's a lot more clarity on how, for instance, you can get to zero enrichment. But how do you come up with a situation where Iran, still possessing the capability to fire drones and missiles, will move forward? Likewise, will this happen again where Iran decides, okay, I need something and therefore I'm going to go ahead and make the strait impassable again? So this is the most toughest part. How do you physically deal with it? And I think the Gulf states, in the long run, will try to come up with ways where they reduce dependency for their energy exports. And Vice President J.D. Vance, he's in Islamabad, Pakistan. He's ready for high-stakes peace talks with Iran. We just learned that he met with Pakistan's prime minister. This was shortly after the Iranian delegation did the same. And we've learned new details about the talks from Iranian state-affiliated media. Talks between Tehran and Washington are expected to start this afternoon, last about a day. But as for the negotiations themselves, each country has submitted a proposal. The U.S. proposal focuses on reopening the Strait of Hormuz and stresses Iran must commit to no nuclear weapons. However, Iran's proposal contains some non-starters for the U.S., including that the U.S. acknowledge Iranian control of the strait and reparations are paid for war damages. We have team coverage for you this morning. CNN Clarissa Ward from Riyadh, Betsy Klein from the White House. Let's check in with Clarissa first. We now hear that the talks are moving forward, although those prerequisites that were required by the Iranian Speaker of the Parliament were not met. Ends to attacks in Lebanon, the paid reparations already. What do we know about what's ahead?
Well, we have journalists who are in Islamabad, including our own international diplomatic editor, Nick Robertson, are being kept in a hotel sort of across the street from where these talks are taking place. And they're being given very little information as to what the format of these talks is, what the exact start time is, whether they will be held directly, indirectly. But one thing is clear, as you just mentioned in your introduction, which is the glaring disparity between Iran's position coming into these talks and the U.S.'s position going into these talks. And basically, they have a relatively small amount of time in which to find some serious overlap. Previously, as you mentioned, the head of the Iranian delegation, primary interlocutor with the U.S., Mohammad Ghalibaf, who's the Speaker of Iran's parliament, had said that the talks wouldn't even begin unless there was a ceasefire in Lebanon and unless Iran's assets were unfrozen. Now, we know that that ceasefire in Lebanon has not transpired. There has been continued Israeli military activity in the south of the country up until this morning, although there has been some movement on the question of peace talks with ambassadors from Israel and Lebanon holding a conversation over the phone and plans for them to meet in Washington, D.C. this coming week. For those in the region, and particularly here in the Gulf where I am, the primary focus is on that crucial Strait of Hormuz, which continues to be under a sort of chokehold of Iran, despite the fact that this ceasefire and these talks were literally predicated on Iran agreeing to open the strait completely. According to our calculations, just a handful of vessels, most of them Chinese, have headed toward the strait today. And when you compare this to nearly 200 ships going through every day before the war, it gives you a sense of just what a dramatic slowdown we are talking about. And for all these Gulf countries, the idea that Iran would in some capacity be able to maintain its control over the strait, even if they do open it up, is absolutely a red line. So a lot of pressure on that U.S. delegation going into these talks and the Iranian delegation, and a lot of questions as to what these talks can achieve in such a short space of time, Victor.
Clarissa Ward for us there in Riyadh. Thank you, Clarissa. And let's talk now about the view from Washington. CNN's Betsy Klein is joining us from the White House. What have you heard from the administration?
The administration is clearly watching this incredibly closely. Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, arriving in Islamabad earlier today for these very high-stakes negotiations during this very fragile ceasefire with all of the pressure and challenges that Clarissa just laid out. Now, who is involved in these talks here is very notable because we have learned that the Iranians said they didn't want to negotiate anymore with Witkoff and Kushner. They, of course, have been leading talks on behalf of the U.S. prior to the start of this conflict and are some of the president's most trusted advisors. Vice President J.D. Vance stepping in here now, and Iran has signaled that they begin as a more reasonable negotiator. But ahead of all of this, we've learned that Vance and delegation met with Pakistan's prime minister, really underscoring the key role that this country has begun to play as a mediator in these talks. But as he departed Washington yesterday, Vice President Vance telling reporters that President Trump had given him some pretty clear guidelines from which to negotiate. And we know from our reporting that Vance has spent weeks in the lead up to these talks behind the scenes preparing for this moment, really emerging as a central player. So this is also a key moment for him politically as he looks to establish himself as a peacemaker on behalf of the Trump administration. Now, at the heart of these talks is reconciling the Trump administration's 15-point plan with a 10-point plan from the Iranians. The White House had said that one of the 10-point plans put forth by the Iranians was fundamentally unserious and had been thrown away. They said there is another plan that they described as workable that they have been communicating with the Iranians on privately. They say that that is more likely to move forward. But President Trump's red lines, specifically the end of uranium enrichment, remain unchanged, according to the White House. Now, just to give you a sense of the jockeying in the media ahead of these talks, we've already learned that an Iranian official told Reuters that the U.S. had agreed to unfreeze Iranian assets from Qatar. A senior U.S. official pushing back strongly on that, calling those reports false, but the world now waiting to see whether and when and how these talks will begin, Victor.
Historic talks between the U.S. and Iran are expected to happen today. Vice President J.D. Vance arrived in Pakistan this morning to head up the U.S. delegation. He says he'll know pretty quickly if the Iranians are negotiating in good faith. We're trying to have a positive negotiation. The president gave us some pretty clear guidelines, and we're going to see. The Iranians say there are more than 70 representatives in their delegation headed up by the Speaker of Parliament. As the talks open, several ships are heading toward the Strait of Hormuz, 5 or fewer, and President Trump insists it's going to open completely soon.
The strait will open up. If we just left, the strait's going to, otherwise they make no money. So the strait's going to open. But what we have is no nuclear weapon, but we'll open the strait anyway.
Let's bring in now CNN Global Affairs analyst Kimberly Dozier. Kimberly, let me start here. First, good morning to you. Iran's state affiliate media is reporting that Iranian officials have signaled that no final decision has been made yet on whether there will be talks, whether they'll proceed. Is it conceivable at this point that a 71-person delegation from Iran and the Vice President of the United States come to Islamabad and they don't talk?
Iranians know the value of high-stakes negotiations and also of embarrassing the other side. They understood in the ceasefire agreement that they thought they agreed to that there would be a ceasefire and attacks on Lebanon.
Yesterday, there was a first movement of the troops from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia, along with some jets, some support jets. That's what Al Jazeera is reporting. This is the first visible movement of Pakistani forces from Pakistan to the Saudi Arabia. Now, Pakistan has to say that this is to honor the defense agreement which was signed between the Pakistan and the Saudi Arabia. But this is the first visible movement, and also Akash, the timing, Shivani, the timing of this movement of Pak troops from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia when talks were underway.
Yes, just hold on. That's exactly the big update that we're getting. There's not just, of course, that Saudi-Pakistan pact that is to be taken care of, but there also movement of Pakistan Pakistani fighter jets that we're getting to know about towards Saudi Arabia. That is the country that they have a military defensive pact with. Now that has also played its own role. It's been casting a shadow as far as this entire conflict is concerned. Saudi Arabia, not that keen to have any hostilities end with Iran as we speak. But what impact does it have now after these talks stalemate? Has Pakistan been forced into, honoring that pact that they have with Saudi Arabia?
We still don't have the clear picture, Shivani, but the fact is that from day one, Pakistan has been evading any kind of situation where Pakistan is forced to honor this defense agreement. In fact, from day one, right after signing the agreement, they launched strikes on Afghanistan. Then again, when tensions escalate in West Asia, they again launched strikes on Afghanistan. Then instead of playing the role of combatant, they played the role of the mediator, perhaps engaging in the situation and perhaps saying that we are trying to pacify and bring down the temperature, so on and so forth.
Can I just add that even as these Islamabad talks were taking place, Saudi Arabia's defense ministry said in a statement that Pakistani fighter jets and support aircraft had arrived at the King Abdullah Aziz Air Base in the country's eastern province. So I think there's a lot of machinations working on here, even as the peace talks are going on, Saudi Arabia to make this statement.
Yeah. And also, Shivani, very interesting, these troops were moved when talks were underway. It's not that these troops were moved when talks collapsed and JD Vance left Islamabad. So it means that Pakistanis had some idea in mind because they were the mediators. They were present in the room that these talks are going to go nowhere. So before Saudi Arabia could put pressure on them to send troops, they themselves send it to Saudi Arabia, perhaps keeping Saudi Arabia. Even there were multiple reports also that Shehbaz Sharif could visit Saudi Arabia soon.
Yes. So a lot is happening, mind you, as far as this region is concerned, and Pakistan's role is also curiouser by the day. We keep a very close track on this, on their movement and military support to Saudi Arabia. We don't know what happens really after a week's time. The ceasefire, will it persist or will it break? And what happens after that ceasefire comes to an end? But take a look at this perspective from Nick Robertson from CNN on the failed talks, or at least the talks that have ended in a statement.
So this is where we just heard from the Vice President, no deal on the talks with Iran over 16 hours, an absolute marathon session through the night here in the center of Islamabad. It is dawn now. When the talks began on Saturday, it was late afternoon, and we've quite literally witnessed the sun go down and then the sun come up again. And what the Vice President has said is that Iran, he doesn't believe, is giving that fundamental core agreement about its nuclear aspirations. He didn't say what happens next. He didn't talk about a specific end to the ceasefire. He didn't say if it's a return to war. But what he said the United States has done is given Iran its final and best offer. The ball, it appears, is in Iran's court to come up with answers now that it hasn't been able to through this marathon session of talks. The Vice President also saying that through the night he continually kept President Trump briefed and updated. He said that he'd come into these talks positive, but fundamentally the Vice President coming in looking, he hoped to get a relatively quick solution. The Iranians with a much larger delegation and a much different negotiating style coming into these talks with perhaps the aspiration, as they have done in the past, of talking, drilling down, getting what they wanted. Fundamentally, also, the Iranians believe that they still hold cards, that they can still control the Strait of Hormuz, and to them, that is something that is leverage, real leverage, they believe, and that it could get more than they were offered here in Islamabad.
Well, the talks have taken place, but there is no agreement. After 21 hours of negotiations in Islamabad, US have walked away without any concrete deal. Both sides are now blaming each other. US Vice President JD Vance said Washington put a final offer on the table. He said Iran simply refused to accept the terms. The key demand was a clear commitment from Tehran to not pursue nuclear weapons and more. But Iran is pushing back hard. Iran accuses Washington of making unreasonable demands and blocking progress. The biggest sticking point also remains Iran's right to enrich uranium. and the future of the Strait of Hormuz. So where does this leave the region and the war now? The ceasefire is holding for now. The mood is tense though. There's no breakthrough, no roadmap, no clarity on what happens next. What raises the big questions is also, does no deal now mean there will be escalation once the ceasefire period elapses? Could we see a return to strikes? And is diplomacy running out of time? For now, the talks have failed and the standoff is back where it started with more uncertainty than ever.
Whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We've been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms.
Let's go across to Colonel Rohit Dev, defense expert, now joining us. No real breakthrough. It kind of raises a question if the both sides even had the right conditions to meet face to face and work out any agreement, given how wide the gap between the two sides is. If nuclear weapons, enriched uranium, and Strait of Hormuz are the difference points as far as the two sides are concerned, then what were they even meeting on the table for?
So good morning, Shivani and the viewers. I think this was not, ordered to be any kind of negotiation. This was just a premeditated step, a geopolitical step, if you may like, to showcase that they were very serious as the U.S. delegation. Dare I say they were not. These talks were not meant to succeed at all. And where I come from is 2025 summers, when the Americans bombed Iran, claimed resolute victory by saying everything nuclear has been demolished, and they left Israel in a lurch with a lot of unfinished business, which was supposed to be done that time. Now, what has happened is the internal, turmoil after that, which happened in the U.S., led to a rethink of the side of the U.S. administration, and obviously, then they came together with the Israelis to continue on the path of what they wanted to achieve, insofar as Islamic radicalization and other aspects of existential threat to Israel were concerned, and also to put the might of the U.S. Behind that effort. And that is why the Oman talks were deliberately failed by the United States of America, because they didn't want to have any kind of a negotiation. Coming to this one, the only difference is that you had J.D. Vance coming in himself, and I'll tell you why he came. He came because Witkoff and Jared Kushner had a problem in Oman, and they were shown as a face, and the American public got antagonized by what the actions Trump and the U.S. were taking in the West Asia region militarily. So Vance came with a purpose that yes, it will fail, but then he can go back.
We have climbing gyms all over the country, so we use Google Meet to connect with our staff. The automated note-taking feature of Gemini has been really valuable. Saves me so much time. We're never
Dear or listen to them. Now, if you come to the demands, and you yourself have rightly said these 2 or 3 demands, you tell me which country can say with conviction and say that we are not going to use nuclear enrichment even for peaceful, leave the defense part. Can you stop any country from a peaceful utilization of nuclear energy? The answer is no, because fossil fuels are going to go away one day or the other, and people have to make that. And if somebody uses for a weapon, you can't stop it. The weapon can also come from somewhere else, and we find it somewhere else as well. The other part is the Hormuz part is very critical to Iran from one perspective. That they have lost a lot of money through the destruction caused by these offensive by the U.S.-led team, and they have to recoup. And they, as per their parlance and interpretation of UNCLOS, they have saying that 12 nautical miles is territorial zone, and it's deliver it away by ratifying the treaty.
Colonel, I've got to come back to you. I understand the point that you're making. Ashok Saxena, former diplomat, is also joining us. The problem is that if these conditions were not to be met, no nuclear program, the highly enriched uranium to be handed over, the problem is not enriching uranium for civil power alone. The problem is that they have got highly enriched uranium, which is ready for weaponization. I think US is asking for that uranium to be handed over to the international agency and, of course, the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Ashok Saxena, the problem is whether Iran likes these conditions or not. They may have their own point of view. But US cannot have any deal which does not have these points, because then the objectives of the military war haven't been met. The objectives were no nuclear weapons, no enriched uranium, etc. So that is why there can be no deal, which brings me back to my original question. Why was this meeting even taking place when some of the biggest points were not going to be adhered to or agreed to?
For that, and let me put it this way: that when such meetings take place, both the sides really put their maximalist positions there. The first meeting is not the venue at which the biggest points are sorted out. That is where you try to build some sort of confidence, you take baby steps, move forward, so that you are trying to expand the circle of convergence where you have. You don't take up absolutely the most difficult of the questions. That is point number one. But let me also tell you that both Iran and the United States, in my view, are quite tired as far as the ongoing conflict is concerned. United States, we know, as far as Mr. Trump is concerned, his domestic preoccupations, domestic reasons, midterm poll, economy, popularity of the war, his own popularity is sinking. So he definitely wants an off-ramp, he definitely wants an exit. So when Mr. Vance came at the head of such a huge delegation, 300 members, obviously they were not coming for a picnic to Islamabad. They wanted some results. They were hopeful that they will be able to achieve something. Iran also, it might not have traveled all that distance, but it was a very senior delegation. Speaker of the Parliament, Foreign Minister, etc., 70 members. So they also have suffered hugely. I think, IRGC and Iran at this moment might be, doing some chest thumping, saying that, we can continue, but they have suffered hugely.
Yeah, so that begs the question, why no deal? If both sides are tired, and, Ashok Saxena, can I just say, for the benefit of our viewers, this isn't really the first time they're negotiating, is it? They've been negotiating for a while. The whole military offensive has happened on exactly these points of nuclear power and nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. So it's not like they're thrashing it out for the first time. They've been, US has been saying this for many years, if not the last 4 weeks that this war has been going on. But I'll come back to you, sir. I've got some important updates now coming in as far as the future of these talks is concerned. This is CNN News 18 exclusive. Sources close to Pakistan government are telling us that the talks have entered what is called a pause and response phase, not really a breakdown. This is their view and their version. The ball is in Iran's court on the final US offer. JD Vance clearly said that the US is departing with a simple proposal, a final offer and best offer, and is now waiting for Iran's response. The offer has not been withdrawn, keeping the channel open 24/7. Iranian officials or state media have not been issued a formal no to the latest US offer. So is there still some hope? Is this just grandstanding going on as far as, the Iranians are concerned? Will they possibly just buy some more time and come right back to those conditions, to the final and best US offer? My colleague Akansha Swaroop is also joining us with more on this. Akansha, what more are we learning from Pakistan?
There's no grandstanding out here, given that the red lines have now been defined, and this was in fact a huge bone of contention in terms of both sides, what they want, what is the end game. At least that has now been defined in terms of what is not expected out of Iran. Because remember, as JD Vance left Islamabad, he's clearly made it very evident that they have an agreement. Whether they want to take it or not, they'll have to decide. The ball has been left in Iran's court, And what we are learning from inputs that have been shared by Manoj Gupta, we are being told that you still have the other big players from the American delegation like Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, which are in Islamabad. And Pakistan is currently ensuring that both sides do engage. So to say that these talks were a complete collapse, even though they have not arrived upon an agreement, will be fairly nascent. We have also been getting intel coming in from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, where Iran is now saying that they do want dialogue and diplomacy to, in fact, move forward, and that is how Iran can ensure that their own national interests are indeed safeguarded. Will they be able to be persuaded into stopping their nuclear ballistic missiles program, to stop the uranium enrichment program? We do not know, because this has become one big bone of contention for the United States. All of this as the Strait of Hormuz, even though blockaded for the United States and its allies, including Israel and the Persian Gulf allies, we are being told is still partially open and vessels are still moving. Of course, those are friendly nations to Iran. But we'll have to see. There's going to be a next round of negotiations, and if these delegations, which are left currently behind in Islamabad, as Ambassador Saganhar was also highlighting, that if a 300-member delegation from the American side was brought to Islamabad, they certainly do mean business right now. They do want some kind of forward movement, but the Americans are also aware that Iran is currently emboldened and that they will have to put a stop to all of these bargaining chips, whether it is in fact the blockading of the Strait of Hormuz or even their ambitions in pursuing a nuclear ballistic missile program.
As I stay with us, Rahul Sisaldar is also joining us. Rahul, the situation is what it is. The U.S. believes the ball is in Iran's court. They've given their best and final offer, but there's no agreement. And shockingly, there's a disagreement on some of the most critical aspects, which were the objectives before the war began. They have been the objectives for U.S. and Israel for the last 1 year, because they've been striking their nuclear facilities. But on nuclear facilities, on nuclear weapons, enriched uranium, on Strait of Hormuz now, there's simply no meeting ground.
Yeah, so it's not shocking, really, Shivani. Let's just be realistic here. We weren't expecting a signed document. So that the conversation could then continue in a defined setting and with defined red lines about how to break through. So what we've got after 21 hours is that yes, the talks have ended in a stalemate and both sides are claiming leverage, but the first round has drawn hard lines from both sides around 3 points. So this is fundamental. Before this conversation began, Iran came to the table with 10 points, the US with 15 points. Now we're being told that the two sides have narrowed their differences to just 3, which is a massive positive leap. Now, we haven't had consensus on those 3 points, but at least now we know what those 3 points were. Till now, we had people like Donald Trump and on the other side, various players in the Iranian regime that were constantly changing and shifting the goalposts. Now that's not going to happen, because now we know that the outstandings are 3. It's Hormuz, uranium enrichment, and Lebanon. So we have now a basis from which to move forward. While no next round has been scheduled, the door to talks remains open. Both sides have said that they're going to go back and they're going to discuss with their principals a way forward. No one has come out and said we're going to resume hostilities. So this is a very big positive. Yes, the negotiations have stalled, but the pause on the war hasn't ended. This gives us a few more days. Remember that Donald Trump has set a 15-day deadline for both sides to basically come to some sort of an agreement. Those days, I think there are 4 or 5 days left now. And because both sides now know where each one of them stands, they can go back and say, okay, so development is the basic definitive non-negotiable for Iran, then we can perhaps let Iran have some sort of loose understanding on that, but they will have to concede on the Strait of Hormuz in a way that is closer to the US position, and on Lebanon, perhaps, which is closer to the Israeli position. Remember also, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be going and meeting with President Trump. So that's an important conversation. But breaking news coming in, and what we're going to do now, and Shivani and the rest of the team are going to sort of play this in a very newsy way. They're going to move around and they're going to get out the news, and then we're going to use the vast experience we have in our studios to break down those developments like we do for you viewers every day on Perspective 360. You know, we have that show, it's called Periscope 360, and at 4 o'clock we usually go to the walls, we break all the stories, and then we get the big brains trust, which are our analysts, to analyze each one of those developments. So that's how we're going to do it. We're being told that there is some big breaking news coming in. Akansha, over to you.
Yes. Coming in is from the US President. Update coming in his latest post, US President has revealed what is being called his Trump card. So Donald Trump's Trump card, which is being called a civil blockade. I have this article that Donald Trump has now put out. He has posted this article because this is just the news.com government article. This says the Trump card the president holds if Iran won't bend is a naval blockade. It also, as a subheader, has this interesting line that Trump used a naval blockade to weaken Venezuela before Maduro's ouster. There is a picture, massive picture of US's naval might. But what could a naval blockade look like, Akansha? This is an interesting. Donald Trump himself is kind of popularizing the idea that his Trump card is a naval blockade. Absolutely, and this is something we will bring Rahul also in on, because the big piece of breaking input over here is what Donald Trump has in fact indicated through this article, where he said if Iran refuses to accept the final deal, the United States offered on Saturday, Trump could bomb Tehran back to the Stone Ages as he vowed, or he might just reprise the successful teetering Iranian economy and ratchet up diplomatic pressure on China.
Akansha, I also want to just quickly go across.
I just wanted to bring in a quick observation, and building on the point that Shivani made. Yes, it's also something that has been used against Cuba recently, so not just Venezuela, but also Cuba. But the fact is, over the last 24 hours, and perhaps we can pull out some of those pictures and even perhaps go to the Strait of Hormuz, the US did move 2 warships. They were trying to conduct a sweep of the area for mines. So if we can go to that map, that would be great. The two of you see that out. But very quickly, the Trump card is the naval blockade. The naval blockade, will it actually lead to the Iranians actually bowing? Because that's what the Iranians have been doing, haven't they? They've actually been able to enforce the naval blockade. So I don't see how that is going to be actually something that could alleviate the situation.
Point that he's made over here, weigh in on this perhaps. He's saying that we could ratchet up diplomatic pressure on China and India by cutting them off one of the
regime hopefully would then be toppled and we would have a more amenable administration in place in Iran, which goes beyond the IRGC. So those red lines constantly shifted. On the Iranian side, they will
representatives.
Are you ready to feel good about your body? LifeMD can help. Get started at lifemd.com. He reads the room and then goes against it. Those Iranian leaders.
Really good question, and I think the selection of J.D. Vance was on purpose. Could have sent somebody else, a real hardliner on the issues with Iran, but they sent J.D. Vance, who at times has been reported to say, we've accomplished our goals, we've done what we need to do. That is, I think, a plan by the United States to send the one guy over there who the Iranians think may be more moderate. But I think J.D. Vance is going to be very clear about the guidelines in the United States.
And so we're looking at some of the video footage that we do have from the region. Kushner there on your screen, as well as a special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. We've mentioned him a number of times. And so I want to ask you, as we're looking at this meeting happen between Pakistan as well, with them being the central location for all of this to happen, Ryan, why was Pakistan chosen as this location? It's there in the Middle East, of course, so they're in the middle of this conflict that's happening. But we've seen these leaders meet in other countries in the past. This time, Pakistan was chosen.
Very good question, and it's simply that Pakistan, for the Iranians, was a safe place to go, in their view. It is a very dangerous place overall. If you talk with our security apparatus, it's one of the most dangerous places on earth for our diplomats, for our entourage. And I'm sure we've got all kinds of security in there. But it's a place you always want to, in these negotiations, pick a place where both sides are comfortable. I would say we are as comfortable there as a couple of other places in the Middle East, although we're very wary of Pakistan. But having said that, the Iranians needed to come someplace, and they weren't going to go any place in the Middle East that they've already thrown a missile into or whatever. And we weren't going to, go meet in China or Russia with them. So there had to be another place, and Pakistan was the best choice they could all come up with.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we do know that there have been several other splintering conflicts that have been happening here amid the U.S. and Iran conflict, with Iran taking aim at other Gulf states as well. I want to put up this map on the screen just so folks have an idea of what we're talking about. There have been some targeted locations there in the United Arab Emirates, which is very close to the Strait of Hormuz, as well as other nations reporting that bombs have dropped, again, from Iran into those countries. Pakistan might have been that key location where these conversations
think about this in terms of history, of course, all of these conversations, we can always draw a bit of what we know about how things have gone in the past. We do know that conversations with the Middle East between different U.S. administrations have been quite difficult in the last few years, but these are maybe the most significant since 1979, since the original Iranian Revolution. I have to ask you, Brian, especially when it comes to the United States and their typical positioning, what else do we know? What can history tell us about how these conversations might ultimately go?
Basically, that the Iranians will attempt to delay, always, and obfuscate. This is their negotiating style. So bringing in this large delegation is their way of saying these issues are very, very detailed. We can't solve this in this round of negotiations. This has got to be played out. And by the way, we're not going to be able to do it in 2 weeks. This is more like weeks and weeks and weeks. This is a typical Iranian strategy. It's frankly the way they've negotiated for 47 years. And the thing to remember is this may be a different place now, attacking their neighbors and lashing out with the way they have, has, I think, limited their ability to negotiate. Our negotiators, Christina, have to be very tough and say, hey, we are going to solve this in a matter of days, not weeks. We aren't coming back over and over while you deliberate in Iran, which is part of the problem, by the way. We don't know who's really in charge in Iran. We've got these people in Pakistan right now negotiating, but the IRGC, the military arm of Iran, has a big say in all of this. In fact, they lead Iran, and whatever's going on has to be double checked with whatever leadership they have left. So it's a very fractured situation. But this kind of negotiating style, this way of dealing with the West, is very, very old in terms of years. And you feel it when you are in the Middle East talking with Syrians, Lebanese, Egyptians, frankly, Israelis. It's a very, very tough place to do business. And one realizes it very quickly when you travel in that region.
All right, and Brian, as you were talking about the supposed new leader there, we do know that this is the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. He is supposedly, though, by Reuters saying we're still recovering from severe facial and leg injuries that he suffered in an airstrike that killed his father at the beginning of this war. That's according to sources that are really close to the matter, saying that Khamenei's face was disfigured in this attack on the supreme leader's compound in central Tehran, and he also suffered a significant injury to both of his legs. And so we'll continue to watch as all of this is unfolding. Brian, anything else we should really be keeping our eyes on as this third round of talks is reportedly underway?
Yeah, I would say to viewers, look at what's being done, not what's being said. The Iranians will say anything in public, but it's what goes on behind the scenes. And as to Khamenei, I think at the end of the day, we're going to find out it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz. There's somebody else, not him. And that time will tell. But we will have to watch these negotiations on a time basis, Christina. Either the Americans are going to push for a quick settlement here, or I think they go home.
All right, and so what we're seeing there, again, some video footage from how all of this is unfolding there in Pakistan. We appreciate, as always, political analyst Brian Sobel for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Down the latest. Thanks so much, Brian.
My pleasure always, Christina.
All right, have a good Saturday. Want to bring that.
weapons during transit. The data was there, but it was costly to capture. Putting up some video there on your screen of some of these arrivals that happened just a little while ago as Vice President J.D. Vance is now on the ground there in Islamabad. He's there along with Iranian negotiators as they're holding their highest levels of talks in half a century today in Pakistan. This is amid the 6-week war, and it comes as President Trump says that his military is now clearing the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM has since confirmed that 2 naval destroyers passed through the strait today to clear sea mines that were laid by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard. But to unpack a little bit more about what we've learned there in the region and the state of these conversations, I'd now like to bring in Ross Harrison. He's the senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and author of the new book, Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. Ross, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks, Christina. Lovely being with you.
Well, there's a lot to unpack. As we said, we keep learning new information as these talks are ongoing there in the region. I want to put this up on the screen for yourself and others at home so they can get a sense of what we're now watching. This is being reported by Reuters saying this: another round of negotiations will likely be held tonight or tomorrow. And that's according to Iran's state-affiliated news source reports, saying that this is a sign, and again, citing a source that's close to some of those negotiators. So I have to ask you, as we're listening into that message, what could this possibly indicate about the state of the talks that are ongoing?
Well, I think they seem to be, Christina, a bit more perhaps extensive, and perhaps they're being conducted, at least on the American side, with a bit more patience than the last round of talks that pre-existed this war. As the lead-up said, this is the first or the highest level of negotiation that has taken place, direct negotiations, taken place since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So I think it indicates that both parties have something to lose if the negotiations would collapse or fail, and both parties have something to gain. So I think at this early juncture, it's hard to read too much into it, but I think it's a better sign that they're continuing, that there's a second round, than if they had collapsed. And it appears, Christina, that they, at least in the second round, if not the first round, there were reports that these were proximity talks, which means they're being conducted in the same venue, but with the Pakistanis being the interlocutors or the mediators. But it looks like there's actually direct, at least in the second round, and maybe even part of the first, there's some direct contact between the American and Iranian delegations.
Absolutely, and so we're looking at some more video as well. Jared Kushner there on the screen. We also know that U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff is attending these talks in Pakistan alongside Vice President J.D. Vance. And so when it comes to what Iran has kind of laid out in some of those demands, saying that they would like the release of some of its foreign overseas assets, Iran is also demanding control of the Strait of Hormuz, payment of war reparations, and a ceasefire across the region, including Lebanon. That's according to reporting from Iran State TV and some of those officials. I have to ask you, as Vice President J.D. Vance is there sitting at the table having these conversations, how likely is it that the U.S. is willing to bend to some of these tactics or ultimately these demands by Iran?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to unpack, Christina, is not so much the specific demands, because remember, these specific demands were made publicly. And some of these demands go back to before the war. Some of them were put forth during the war or during the phase of the war that occurred before the de-escalation that we've seen in the last few days. So I think it's important to understand that the way these
negotiations are to take place privately is very, very different than they would be in the public space. Public space, there's a lot of grandstanding, both on the American side and possibly on the Iranian side. I think what's important, Christina, is to sort of unpack what's important to each of the sides. On the Iranian side, there's a couple things that are noteworthy. One is that they will have reestablished deterrence that they believe was lost at the end of the last war, which was the 12-day war of June of 2025. At the end of that war, they believe they had lost deterrence and that they were then set up for the war that started February 28th of 2026, the one they're negotiating about now. So for them, at the end of the day, they have to believe that they've regained deterrence. And the fact that J.D. Vance is there is both a symbolic signal to them and I think a strategic signal to them that perhaps during this war, through the economic pain and some of the kinetic pain they've caused in the region, that they've reestablished deterrence. The other piece that's very, very important to them, Christina, is financial remuneration or financial the ability for them to reconstitute their economy. Whether that comes through sanctions relief, whether it comes through reparations, whether it comes through some kind of a toll structure in the Strait of Hormuz, I think what we need to focus on is less the demands that have been made publicly and the fact that Iran is going to need to rebuild and it's going to need connection to the economic community in some form and it's going to need some form of payment. So how they parse that, Christina, between the demands of the United States and the sequencing of the United States, we really don't know. On the American side, I think what's important for the Americans is the cessation of hostilities. I think the United States is ready to not resume a second phase in this war. So I think cessation of hostilities is important. Opening the Strait of Hormuz is obviously important, and some type of discussion or concession on the nuclear side. We don't know what that looks like, Christina, because much of the conversation publicly over the last couple of weeks has been on the Strait of Hormuz. So we don't know whether there's some ability for the United States to soften its position on the nuclear side. I think the Iranians are going to have some red lines, but I think there's also, within those red lines, there's also some give and take. So I think it's really too soon to say, but I think the first phase that we're seeing now at least indicates that they're having those conversations privately, that they were having only through tweets and in the public space heretofore.
Absolutely, and you were talking even about the importance of the Strait of Hormuz. We did hear from CENTCOM earlier today, and it was President Trump had said it initially. CENTCOM later came out and said this, that 2 U.S. Navy-guided missile destroyers were able to conduct operations going through the Strait of Hormuz, saying that they wanted fully clear of sea mines that were previously laid by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Again, that's been one of the focal points of this conversation between the United States and Iran. And so I have to ask you, when it comes to how Iran postures themselves when they are in these negotiating rooms, of course, we know that you have extensive knowledge of how things operate there in the region, specifically with Iran. How do they show up to the table? What are some of their demands or how they position themselves when having conversations with foreigners?
Well, it depends, Christina, on with whom they're meeting. If they're meeting with their regional neighbors, for example, they show up usually in a third-party country, a country like, for example, the rapprochement that occurred just in 2023, after long years of alienation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They showed up in Baghdad, then in Oman, and then eventually in Beijing for these kind of symmetric talks. The way they would show up with the United States is very, very different because there's an asymmetry here, right? I mean, Iran is a middle power. It's a significant regional power, but it's not a global power. So typically, symbolism is very, very important. I think that's why in this kind of a conversation, the fact that J.D. Vance is there is important. I think what's also important is that dignity is extremely important for Iran, given their long history. So I think it depends upon the particular negotiation we are talking about. In this kind of a negotiation, I think what the Iranians are going to do is make it very clear that this is not the same kind of negotiation that they engage with the United States in the lead up to the June war of 2025 and the recent war or the current war in 2026. That they have interests, they have demands.
deal that had been negotiated between the United States, Iran, but also between the United States and all permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and Iran, that the United States walked away from that nuclear deal. And then, so that was sort of the first sort of betrayal that the Iranians believe they've experienced at the hands of this administration. And then also in 2025 and 2026, in the middle of negotiations, middle negotiations, they were basically attacked. So for them, they're gonna engage in these conversations, these negotiations, I think in a serious manner. The folks that they have sent, the head of the parliament, or we call Majlis in Iran, Ghalibaf, and the foreign minister, Agashi, and the whole team they brought indicate they're approaching this with seriousness, but they're also going to do it with a very, very clear sense of looking at this administration and whether they can actually, what they negotiate, they can actually be reinforced with facts on the ground. And that's something that remains to be seen.
Absolutely. And so we have a graphic up on the screen as well, so folks can picture who is coming to the table, the key players in these negotiations that are currently ongoing. I do want to talk about this. We do know that the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said that he had spoken with Iran's president and highlighted to him the importance of de-escalating the situation through these ceasefire talks. What else do we know about the position of other Western nations who are, I'm sure, monitoring how these conversations are going there in the region?
Yeah, I don't think there's too many winners other than perhaps the way at least Prime Minister Netanyahu sees the conflict. There aren't too many winners if we go into a second phase of this war. So I think all of the Western powers, and frankly, we haven't talked about China, but I think China is also a stakeholder here. All of them, I think, are signaling to all sides that the stakes are high and that there needs to be some form of de-escalation. I think what's important about the French is that they have been very, very wary of the U.S. agenda here and signing on to this war. So I think they believe that they have a bit more influence with Iran than some other Western powers, particularly the United States. So I think it's not just the French or the Western powers. I think it's also the Eastern powers. China has also indicated that to the Iranians that they want this conflict to de-escalate, and I think they're also signaling to the United States as well. So I think the global community is not necessarily coming together, but I think there is somewhat of a common refrain that this war might not have been a wise move on the part of the United States and Israel, and there needs, in order to limit the damage and to preserve the interest of all the parties, both the United States, Israel, and Iran, and the global community, that this war needs to end. I think that's the message that you're hearing more broadly, but also expressed more specifically with President Macron.
And we're going to continue to watch all of that international reaction to what we know. But I do want to let you know, Ross, this just came into our newsroom. It's again reported by Reuters. There was no Stewart confirming that a third session of Iran-U.S. talks are expected to be held tonight in Islamabad. That's again according to Iran State TV, citing its reporter that's there at the scene. And so I have to ask you, doing some quick math here, it's about 11 p.m. right now in Islamabad. They're 9 hours ahead of the Eastern Coast time here in the United States. Quite late for these discussions to ongoing. Is this typical of some of these conversations that can be held between two nations going into the late hours here to get through, possibly to come to some sort of conclusion?
Yeah, of course. I mean, during the JCPOA, the negotiations for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the negotiators would sometimes meet around the clock. They would have various teams meeting around the clock. So that's not so much unusual. I think what it indicates, Christina, remember there's the substance and then there's the optics. The optics are, I think, by meeting continuously and around the clock, I think there's a signal, the signal that both sides are trying to send is these are serious talks. Because what happened during the last phase of talks prior to this was that the Americans would meet maybe every week with the Iranians or every 2 weeks with the Iranians. There was no momentum. So one of the things that's important in any kind of negotiation is if there's early signals of success or a certain chemistry between the interlocutors, the negotiators, you want to build on that. So I think what they're trying to say is there might be some momentum here. The other piece I think it signifies, Christina, is that this is a very, very complex set of negotiations. If they actually are negotiations at this point, if they're actually getting to the substance of the issues. Remember, the last time the war and prior to the June 2025 war, is they basically met to talk about the nuclear file, the nuclear issues. Since the war, Iran has widened the battlefield in many ways and created sort of what I call a 3D chessboard, because it's not just about the U.S., Iran, and Israel on the nuclear issue or on the regime change issue or any of the outstanding issues that existed between those three parties. They have widened the war by extending it out to the Gulf Arab states. I just came back from Doha. They widened it out to the Gulf Arab states, and now with the Straits of Hormuz, they have created sort of an economic chokehold. And now we see something we haven't talked about. We have seen conflict in Iraq between the United States and Iran-backed militias there. And we've seen, obviously, a step up in activity between Hezbollah and Israel and Lebanon. And we've seen some activity with Artemis. So now the Rubik's Cube that needs to be solved in order to fully resolve this conflict, whether it goes into three rounds, 4 rounds, 10 rounds, it's going to be very, very difficult to untangle. So the fact that they're showing momentum is a good sign. Very, very early. We just don't know how they're going to sort of untangle a 3D chessboard that was created partially by the Iranians at this point in time. Depends on what happens in the coming days.
Absolutely. And so we'll keep our eyes on more reports if those costs go into a fourth round, as you mentioned, and maybe even continue into the early morning hours there in Islamabad. And so, Rossi, you did bring up the other Gulf nations. Talk a little bit about the fact that you were just in Doha. You were there hearing from all of the other areas and countries there, talking about their particular interests. Did anything stick out to you, maybe on behalf of the Saudis or the UAE, as watching these conversations unfold?
Well, what stuck out to me, I was in Qatar, and I was there when the Iranians